Today we will be discussing some information about slavery in America, and we will start with the definition of slavery. Slavery. Slavery is any system in which principles of property law are applied to people, allowing individuals to own, buy, and sell other individuals as a de jure form of property. Most people still think that slavery doesn't exist anymore because it was abolished. But is that completely correct? No. It still exists, but now has a new name: human trafficking. Let's define that. Human trafficking is the trade of humans for the purpose of forced labor, sexual activity, or commercial sexual exploitation for the trafficker or others. Now I will give you a little review before we start going deep into the topic. What does Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and George Washington have in common besides being presidents of the U.S.? Well, the three men of them were slaveholders. Yep. Even John Newton, the composer of Amazing Grace, was captain of a slave ship in his early life. And Robinson Crusoe, the main character in Daniel Defoe's famous novel, was involved in the slave trade when his ship wrecked at the sea. Slavery in America started in 1619 with 20 African slaves ashore in Jamestown, Virginia. During the 17th century, the European settlers in North America found that African slaves were a cheaper labor source. It is estimated that about 6 to 7 million of African slaves were brought into the Americas during the 18th century, depriving the African continent of some of its healthiest and intelligent men and women. But not only that, also breaking families forever. After the American Revolution, many colonies of the North where agriculture was not an important economic activity started to link the oppression of the African slaves to get their own by the British, and that became one of the main reasons to call for abolition of slavery. We are well aware that slavery was horrendous, but what was the government's stance on slavery in the 1840s and 1850s? Let's see. After the Revolutionary War during 1784, the new U.S. Constitution implicitly recognized the inconstitution of slavery and counting each slave as 3/5 of a person for taxation and representation in Congress, and guaranteeing the right to reclaim any person held to service or labor, or better known as slavery. But by the beginning of the 19th century, slavery in the U.S. was recognized with a series of statutes and penal codes passed in various states to control the activity of slaves and everything relating to slaves and free blacks. The Louisiana Purchase started the discussion of slavery, which became both geographical and political, and started a period of national debate between pro- and anti-slavery states to gain political and economic advantage. Then, by 1820, Congress was in the debate about how to divide the newly acquired territories into slave and free states. The Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1820, was an agreement between the pro- and anti-slavery in the conflict of how to regulate slavery in the Western territories. Constitutionally, the Compromise of 1820 established a precedent for the exclusion of slavery from public territory acquired after the Constitution, and recognized that Congress had no rights to impose upon states looking admission to the Union conditions that did not apply to those states already in the Union. After Missouri's admission to the Union in 1821, no other states were admitted until 1836, when Arkansas became a slave state, followed by Michigan in 1837 as a free state. The debate over slaves and free states remained quiet for almost 30 years, but by the late 1840s, several events occurred that distraught the balance. The U.S. added new territory as a result of the Mexican War, and the question of if that territory would be slave or free started again. California, that had a huge increase of population because of the gold rush, asked Congress to enter the Union as a free state, and at the same time, Texas made a claim territory extending all the way to Santa Fe. Washington, D.C., the national capital, not only allowed slavery, but was home to the largest slave market in North America. In January 1850, Henry Clay presented a bill that would become known as the Compromise of 1850. The terms of the bill included that Texas give up its disputed land in exchange for $10 million to be paid to Mexico, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, and Utah territories were defined, while leaving the question of slavery off the table, and that the issue would be decided when the territories applied for statehood. In addition, the slave trade would be abolished in the District of Columbia, although slavery would still be permitted in the nation's capital. It was agreed that California would be admitted as a free state, but the Fugitive Slave Act was passed to pacify pro-slavery states. This bill was the most controversial of all the bills that made up the Compromise of 1850. It established that citizens were required to aid in the recovery of fugitive slaves, and slave catchers were hired to track them down. Many were captured and returned to slavery. Fugitives had no right to a jury trial. The new law was devastating, and former slaves who had been attempting to build lives in the North left their homes and fled to Canada. This was the beginning of a reign of terror to the black population. Even free blacks were captured and sent to the South, completely defenseless, with no legal rights. The compromise lasted until the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, when Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas proposed legislation allowing the issue of slavery to be decided in the new territories. Although the U.S. Congress outlawed the African slave trade in 1808, the domestic trade flourished, and the slave population in the U.S. nearly tripled over the next 50 years. By 1860, it had reached nearly 4 million, with more than half living in the cotton-producing states of the South. As we can see, the government from 1840s and 1850s didn't have a well-defined stance about slavery. It was merely used for geographical, political, and economic purpose. But until that point, never was considered important the life of thousands of human beings called slaves. What happened next? Does our modern government stance on slavery It's different from the one of the administration in the 1840s and 1850s. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln delivered a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. He made it official that slaves within any state or designated part of a state in rebellion shall be henceforward and forever free. By freeing some 3 million black slaves in the rebel states, the Emancipation Proclamation took out the Confederacy of the majority of its labor force, put international public opinion strongly on the Union side. This showed that something changed from the stance of the 1840s and 1850s administration. But even though the Emancipation Proclamation didn't officially end all slavery in America in 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, making it completely illegal. Yet slavery is still alive and well in America today. The only difference, it's not as obvious. Fortunately, our modern government in the U.S. is acting by leading global efforts to address and stop human trafficking. Its policy involves 3 P's: preventing trafficking, protesting victims, and prosecuting traffickers. To help combat this growing epidemic, both domestically and internationally, the U.S. Congress passed groundbreaking legislation, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, or TVPA for short. The purpose is to combat trafficking in persons, a contemporary manifestation of slavery whose victims are primarily women and children, to ensure just and effective punishment of traffickers and to protect their victims. The TVPA criminalizes and enhances the penalties for human trafficking, provides social services and legal benefits, including visas to some trafficking victims, provides millions of dollars in funding to support programs for trafficking victims domestically and abroad, and includes provisions to monitor and eliminate trafficking internationally. In addition to the Congress passed the End Modern Slavery Initiative, and the bill was signed into law December 23, 2016. This legislation was introduced by Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Bob Corker and was supported by a bipartisan Congress, faith-based organizations, as well as countless individuals.
27 million people are enslaved today across the globe. That's more than 4 times the population of my home state of Tennessee. Modern slavery comes in many forms, and it preys on women and children the most. Rather than holding a school book, children in India are stacking bricks. Rather than sitting in a classroom, young girls in the Philippines are sitting in brothels forced into sexual servitude. In Ghana, young boys are forced into a life of slavery on fishing boats. Over 27 million people around the world today. Daughters, sons, mothers, fathers. It's time to shine a light on the problem, and it's time to turn awareness into action. Together, we can end it. Visit corker.senate.gov to learn more about the End Modern Slavery initiative.
The State Department released the 2017 Trafficking in Persons Report as part of the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act of 2000. It was created because the degrading institution of slavery continues throughout the world, and it's a mandated annual brief which assesses what actions government around the world are taking to address the issue, of course, including U.S. At the report's launch, Secretary Tillerson remarked, "Human trafficking is as old as humankind. Regrettably, it's been with us for centuries and centuries. But it is our hope that the 21st century will be the last century of human trafficking. And that's what we are all committed to do." Human trafficking affects Americans around the world and here at home. But it's not just governments of private organizations that can act to help stop modern slavery. The State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons has a list of action steps that any citizen can take to help fight human trafficking. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2017 expands the Department of Justice's authority to issue public safety and community policing grants to include funds for training and the prevention of human trafficking offenses. This is not only a government's job, it is also every citizen's job and responsibility to make sure to stop this modern slavery, human trafficking. Let's see this video about important steps to help fight human trafficking.
Thought slavery ended more than a century ago? Well, it didn't. It was outlawed, but not ended. Tens of millions are in slavery today. They're everywhere. Cleaning homes, building skyscrapers, picking vegetables. They're making products you buy for your family, your office, your church, that coffee you bought, your car, your cell phone, even your children's clothes. You can find slavery everywhere. These slaves are working right now, every day. They're forced to do it. They don't get paid, and they can't escape. Imagine if you could turn the table on traffickers. Instead of benefiting from slavery, you can become a freedom fighter. By supporting Free the Slaves, you can help people break free. Here's how it works. Step 1. Investigate and identify people who are easy prey for traffickers. People who don't have money can often be forced into slavery when they borrowed during an emergency, or when a drought or storm or earthquake strikes. People migrating for work are especially vulnerable. So are communities without schools or vocational training centers, without legal clinics or banks or medical facilities. Step 2. Provide technical training and financial support to organizations who are already on the front lines. Partner with local groups that want to fight slavery and help them do a better job. Train police to enforce anti-slavery laws. Educate journalists to shine a light on the evils of slavery today. Get everyone involved in the fight. Step 3. Come together at a community level. Educate villagers that debt slavery is illegal. Offers that are too good to be true often are. Organize neighborhood groups to lobby government officials for better schools, healthcare, legal aid, jobs, and access to credit. Set up savings clubs so people can create their own banks. Give people the right tools to take control of their lives. Step 4. Sustain freedom. Help former slaves survive and thrive through counseling, skills training, and financial assistance. Teach people to become barbers, dressmakers, beekeepers. Make it possible for them to do in freedom what they've done in slavery. But this time, keep the money. And when people are free, entire communities can resist and protect themselves. This four-step model works. We've already freed more than 10,000 people worldwide. We've educated tens of thousands more to prevent them from becoming slaves. Hundreds of traffickers have been arrested. It all begins with you. When you join Free the Slaves, you make freedom possible for everyone, everywhere. Get your friends, family, neighbors, and coworkers to join you too. Together, you can safeguard the vulnerable from those who would enslave them.
One point mentioned earlier was that prior to the Civil War, the economy of the South was heavily reliant on slavery. But in present time, how does the Trafficking Victims Protection Act affect the economies of the countries that traffic slaves into the U.S.? It is still unclear how this act affects the economies of other countries. However, whether the TVPA is effective in changing human trafficking in other countries, obtaining an accurate estimate is difficult because there is an obvious gap between the number of rescued victims of human trafficking who form the basis for the statistical data and the total number of trafficking victims in existence. The TVPA criminalizes trafficking-related acts, such as obtaining labor or services through threats of physical harm, abuse, or restraint, or beneficially financially from such coerced labor. In this way, the TVPA targets the profitability of human trafficking. It also provides a method to determine whether countries are meeting the minimum standards and employs a sanctions and regimen for those countries that do not comply or attempt to comply. Under the TVPA, the U.S. government has the power to institute sanctions on countries in the form of removing non-humanitarian, non-trade-related foreign assistance, and will also can vote against and otherwise try to deny. The TVPA gives the president the power to waive the economic sanctions if continued assistance is in the national interest of the U.S., or if a waiver is necessary to protect vulnerable populations, including women and children. At least there is a legal way to pressure these countries to work in order to stop human trafficking. Describe how slaves were treated and kept in the institution of slavery during the antebellum period. How are modern slaves treated and kept in slavery in spite of slavery being illegal? During the decades before the Civil War, slaves grow cotton, which represents half the value of all U.S. exports, and provides almost all of the cotton used in the northern textile industry and 70% of the cotton used in British mills. In the decades before the Civil War, a third of the South's population labored as slaves, performing all kinds of work, but slavery mainly meant arduous field work. Deprivation and physical hardship were the official mark of life under slavery, and slave sales frequently broke up their families. During the early 19th century, slavery experienced a new spurt. Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin gave slavery a new chapter. Between 1792, when Whitney invented the cotton gin, and 1794, the price of slaves doubled. By 1825, field hands who had brought $500 apiece in 1794 were worth $1,500. As the price of slaves grew, so too did their numbers. During the first decade of the 19th century, the number of slaves in the U.S. rose by 33%. During the following decade, the slave population grew another 29%. Slaves suffered extremely high mortality. Most slave infants died during their first year of life, twice the rate of white babies. The ones that survived their first year, it remained twice the white rate though, age 14 through age 14. Because of this high infant and childhood death rate, the average life expectancy of a slave at birth was just 21 or 22 years compared to 40 to 43 years for antebellum whites. Compared to whites, relatively few slaves lived into old age. Slave owners showed surprisingly little concern for a slave's mother's health during pregnancy. Pregnant women didn't get extra rations, and they had to do intensive field work even in the last week before they gave birth, causing enslaved mothers spontaneous abortions, stillbirths, and deaths shortly after birth. In the antebellum South Constitution, about 1/3 of the Southern population, most slaves, lived on large plantations or small farms, and many masters owned fewer than 50 slaves. They were usually prohibited from learning to read or write, and their behavior and movement was restricted. Many masters took advantage of slave women and rewarded obedient slave behaviors with favors. While rebellious slaves were brutally punished, slave marriages had no legal basis, but slaves did marry and raise large families. Most slave owners encouraged this practice, however, did not vacillate to divide slave families by sale. Today, slavery is similar and different from the one of the antebellum period. There are tens of millions of people trapped in various forms of slavery throughout the world today. There's an estimate of 40 million people enslaved worldwide. Human trafficking includes labor slavery, sex slavery, forced marriage slavery, and child slavery. The victims suffer from physical and psychological injuries, even if they are fortunate enough to be rescued. Often, inhumane living conditions cause the trafficking victims to contract illnesses. New slavery has two main characteristics. It's cheap and it's disposable. Slaves today are cheaper than ever. In 1850, an average slave in the South cost the equivalent of $40,000 in today's money. Today, a slave costs about $90. Modern slaves are not considered investments worth maintaining. In the 19th century, it was difficult to capture slaves and transfer them to the U.S. But today, when someone in slavery gets sick or injured, they are simply dumped or killed. When the issue of human trafficking is discussed by law enforcement or the media, prostitution and sexual slavery are often the primary focus. It's true that sex trafficking is a huge problem, but it often overshadows another horrendous consequence of human trafficking: forced labor. There are thousands of immigrants working as forced laborers in the U.S., and many of them actually entered the country legally. They come here believing that they found a lucrative job and an opportunity to obtain a green card. In reality, they have been lied to and end up getting trapped and forced to work with no pay. Labor traffickers use violence, threats, and lies to force people to work against their will. This is a form of modern-day slavery, and it's occurring right under our noses. The reports found that 71% of the victims had entered the U.S. legally on temporary visas. By the time they escaped their traffickers, 69% of the victims were illegal to be in the country. Here's the reasons. Victims are baited with the promise of a good job. When they arrive, their travel documents are snatched. Even if they have a visa, the traffickers hold the documents until they expire and threaten to have them deported to keep them in fear. Most labor trafficking victims find themselves doing domestic work, but a number are also working in agriculture. Many victims pay a recruitment fee to their captors prior to traveling to the U.S. On average, this fee comes to $6,150. Most of these people are coming from extremely poor countries. Giving away that kind of money means putting their families in immense debt, or perhaps even bankruptcy. Sex Sex trafficking is terrible, but one positive is that most people are aware of it. This means that it's more likely to get addressed. Labor trafficking does not enjoy the same amount of press, even though it's also a massive problem. Simply put, in order for this to stop, the issue needs continued exposure. Although trafficking victims are allegedly protected by the TVPA, oftentimes their lack of documentation leads them to be mistreated by legal officials and prosecuted as illegal immigrants. This has a negative effect in the human trafficking problem. Recognizing that the vast majority of sex trafficking victims are not present in the country with an immigration status that would allow them to access to government assistance, such as housing, food stamps, and cash assistance. The TVPA includes provisions for helping trafficking victims who are in the U.S., which are the focus of this. In the years since the passage of the TVPA, the laudable goal of protecting sex trafficking victims in the U.S. has not been adequately accomplished. Many victims who apply for the benefits under the TVPA are denied, though it's not clear why. What's more, it's evident that law enforcement does little to address this issue. This is partially because it's very difficult to prove that someone is actively engaged in labor trafficking. Law enforcement officials are pretty skeptical of illegal immigrants who claim to have been victimized. When police get called to traffickers' houses or workplace, for example, they often trust traffickers over victims. In one case, a farmer shot at a trafficker farm worker who was trying to escape. When the police came, they arrested the farm worker for being an unauthorized immigrant. Trafficking is difficult to recognize without proper training. For example, when police approach victims of trafficking, victims rarely indicate their trafficked status for fear of retaliation by their traffickers. Because local law enforcement officers are more familiar with their jurisdiction and are more likely to have personal connections with the community, they are more likely than federal law enforcement to be approached by witnesses of trafficking or to come in contact with trafficking victims. Unfortunately, because the TVPA targets federal and not local law enforcement, federal officials are more likely than local officials to have training in trafficking recognition and apprehension. Labor traffickers are disgusting individuals who enslave helpless immigrants through fear and coercion. Moreover, they are getting away with it the majority of the time. Traffickers benefit of training human beings for labor and war profits. Modern slavery or human trafficking isn't only just a horrendous crime. It's a very lucrative industry and one of the largest international crime industries in the world. Each year, forced labor in sectors like domestic work, agriculture, construction, manufacturing, and even entertainment generates $15 billion in illegal profit. In the U.S., it's estimated that 100,000 children are forced into prostitution each year. Globally, it's estimated that there are about 30 million victims of human trafficking. 55% of all the victims are women or girls, and 5.5 million of all the victims are children. While the supply of people is an important element in the continuation of human trafficking and forced labor, demand is what really drives the industry. Whereas slaves in 1850 could be purchased for a global weighted average of between US dollars between $9,500 US dollars and $11,000 US dollars, and generate roughly 15 to 20% in annual return on investment. Today, slaves sell for a global weighted average of $420 and $20 in 20 US dollars, and can generate 300 to 500% or more in annual return on investment, depending on the industry. This alone is great reason for pause. It shows us that the value of a human life has decreased. It also reveals a huge increase in intense exploitation of the individual. High demand for forced labor exists for various reasons. One reason is that if employers can purchase a slave through a trafficker, the cost might be high up front, but after that the labor costs are practically nothing. The employer can now generate higher profits. Another reason why demand is able to stay at current levels is because there are little to no risk discouraging traffickers from selling and purchasing trafficked persons. Conviction shows that risks of human trafficking are lower than the risk of trafficking illegal drugs or arms. And since the profit of this illicit industry is so high, the traffickers won't stop until governments make laws that give these people longer convictions for their crimes. Remember, we all can help.